In the hushed, rarefied air of Manhattan's most exclusive private dining room, a single stroke of a pen was about to change the world for 50,000 people. Billionaire industrialist Arthur Sterling, a legend of American business, was about to sign away his entire life's work. The deal worth $11 billion was done. His lawyers from Sullivan and Cromwell had approved it. His bankers from Goldman Sachs had celebrated it. But as his Mont Blanc pen hovered over the signature line, a voice soft as a sigh cut through the silence. A young waitress, risking everything, leaned in and whispered a warning that would ignite a firestorm. "Don't sign this." What could she possibly know that his army of experts had missed? The answer would not only save his company, it would expose a conspiracy of breathtaking greed. The Pinnacle Room was less a room and more a declaration of power. Perched 62 floors above Columbus Circle, its floor-to-ceiling windows presented a god's-eye view of Central Park. A sprawling green carpet laid out for the titans of industry who dined within its soundproofed walls. The air itself seemed expensive, a carefully curated blend of aged leather freesia and the faint metallic scent of ambition. At the head of the massive obsidian table sat Arthur Sterling. At 72, he looked every bit the patriarch of a bygone era. His silver hair was impeccably parted, his suit a bespoke creation from Savile Row that cost more than the car most people drove. But his eyes, a pale and weary blue, told a different story. They held the weight of a 50-year career, spent forging an empire, Sterling Industries, from a single machine shop in Ohio into a global manufacturing powerhouse. And they held the deeper, more personal weight of loss. It had been 2 years since his wife, Martha, had passed, and the silence in his life had been deafening ever since. Selling the company had felt less like a choice and more like a surrender. His children had their own lives, their own passions, far from the grit of foundries and factories. He was tired. The endless quarterly reports, the relentless pressure to innovate, the constant battles with regulators and rivals, it was a young man's game. Across the table, Damien Stryker smiled, a flash of perfectly white teeth in a tanned, handsome face. Stryker was the CEO of Vanguard Equity Partners, the private equity firm acquiring Sterling Industries. He was everything Arthur was not: young, slick, and utterly unsentimental. He spoke in a language of synergies, leveraging, and shareholder value that felt alien to Arthur, who still knew the names of the men who had worked on his factory floor for over 40 years. A historic day, Arthur Stryker said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. He gestured to the 2-inch thick document in the center of the table. "A testament to your life's work. We are honored to be its custodians." Arthur gave a non-committal grunt. He didn't like Stryker. The man's charisma felt manufactured, his compliments hollow. He was surrounded by a phalanx of equally sleek young men in sharp suits, lawyers from the prestigious firm Skadden, Arps, Slate, Mager and Flom. Arthur's own team, led by his longtime general counsel Robert Henshaw, looked tired and outmatched, like old lions facing a pack of hungry wolves. Robert slid the final signature page in front of him, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the line marked with a small yellow flag. "Everything's in order, Arthur. We've been through it 100 times. It's a clean deal. A clean deal. $11 billion. It was a staggering sum, enough to fund his charitable foundation for a century. It was the logical conclusion. The smart move. He uncapped his custom Mont Blanc pen, the one Martha had given him for their 40th anniversary. Its nib was solid gold, its weight familiar and comforting in his hand. This was it. The end of an era. He took a deep breath, the filtered air of the pinnacle room feeling suddenly thin and suffocating. He thought of his first employee, a man named Frank Miller, who had lost 2 fingers on a stamping press in 1975. Arthur had personally driven him to the hospital and paid for his children's college education. He thought of the thousands of families in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania who depended on the pensions and healthcare plans he had fought to protect for decades. Stryker had assured him of Vanguard's commitment to the employees. "The Sterling family is our family now," he'd said with that predatory smile. Arthur had wanted to believe him. He had to believe him. His hand was steady as he lowered the pen. The gold nib was a millimeter from the crisp, heavy paper. The silence in the room was absolute, a held breath of anticipation. It was a moment pregnant with the weight of history finance and the future of 50,000 lives. And then a ghost of a sound, a whisper. Chloe Jensen's hands were trembling, but not from the weight of the silver tray holding a bottle of sparkling water. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. From her peripheral vision, she watched the scene at the head table with an intensity that bordered on painful. She was just a waitress, a nobody, a law student at NYU, paying off a mountain of debt by serving overpriced food to men who wouldn't even register her existence. But she knew. God help her, she knew. Her life was a grueling marathon of lectures, study groups, and 8-hour shifts at the Grand Regent Hotel's fine dining restaurant. To make extra money, she had taken on a side gig that utilized her legal training, late-night document review for a temp agency. It was mind-numbing work, sifting through thousands of pages of discovery documents and contracts for large law firms preparing for litigation or major transactions. 3 weeks ago, she had been assigned a rush job. The client was Skadden Arps. The project code was Project Legacy. For 2 straight nights, fueled by coffee and sheer desperation, she had read through draft after draft of a massive acquisition agreement. She'd cross-referenced appendices, checked definitions, and flagged inconsistencies. She didn't know the names of the companies then, only that it was a huge deal involving an old industrial giant and a private equity firm. One section had caught her eye. It was titled The Sterling Legacy Provision. It was an unusually robust and employee-centric part of the contract, explicitly guaranteeing the full funding and protection of the company's pension plan for no less than 25 years. It locked in healthcare benefits for retirees and mandated that any workforce reductions in the first 5 years could only be done through voluntary buyouts and attrition, not layoffs. It was a beautifully crafted piece of legal protection, a fortress built to protect the little guy. She had been impressed, even moved. Then last night, she had seen the final version, a clean-up review, they called it. The section was still there, but the title had been subtly changed. It was now called the Asset Realignment Protocol. The language was dense, almost impenetrable. But Chloe, her eyes trained by thousands of hours of reading legal text, saw the truth. The fortress had been hollowed out from the inside. The 25-year guarantee was replaced with an 18-month review period. The ban on layoffs was replaced with a clause allowing for synergistic workforce restructuring. And buried deep in a subappendix was a provision that allowed the new owner to terminate the existing pension plan and transfer the assets into a new, far less secure 401k program, a move that would save the buyers hundreds of millions of dollars at the expense of lifelong employees. It was a betrayal codified in legalese, a dagger hidden in a bouquet of corporate jargon. She had reported the discrepancy to her temp agency supervisor, who had told her to stick to the brief and that final changes were above her pay grade. She had been a cog in a machine, and the machine was designed to crush people like Frank Miller. Now standing here, watching the legendary Arthur Sterling, the man whose name was on that beautiful protective clause, about to sign its corrupted version, she felt a wave of nausea. She could walk away, say nothing, keep her job graduate, and become one of them. Or she could risk it all. Her job, her tuition, her future career. She could be fired, blacklisted. She saw Arthur Sterling's shoulders slump slightly, a flicker of profound weariness in his eyes. She didn't see a billionaire. She saw her own grandfather, who had worked for Bethlehem Steel for 40 years, only to see his pension gutted in a corporate buyout. The memory, sharp and bitter, was the only push she needed. Her training dictated she remain invisible, but her conscience screamed at her to act. Moving with a grace she didn't feel, she approached the table to refill Arthur's water glass. Her movements were fluid, practiced. No one paid her any mind. She was part of the furniture. As she leaned over his right shoulder, her mouth was inches from his ear. Damien Stryker was smiling, his eyes fixed on the pen. Robert Henshaw was already looking relieved. Chloe's world narrowed to that single, terrifying moment. The risk was immense, the reward non-existent. It was simply the right thing to do. Her voice was barely a breath, a secret past in the cathedral of power. Mr. Sterling, she whispered, her words urgent and low, meant for him alone. Don't sign this, please. Check Appendix D, subsection 11B. The legacy provision. It's been changed. She pulled back instantly, placing the water bottle on the tray, and turning to leave as if nothing had happened. Her heart was a runaway train. She didn't dare look back. She just walked each step in eternity, expecting a hand to grab her shoulder, to hear an angry voice demanding to know what she had done. But all she heard was a sudden, deafening silence, and then the sound of a heavy gold pen being placed very deliberately back on the table. The click of the Mont Blanc pen against the polished obsidian was a small sound, but in the taut silence of the pinnacle room, it echoed like a gunshot. Every head at the table snapped towards Arthur Sterling. Damien Stryker's perfect smile faltered, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. Arthur, is something wrong? Arthur didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. The whisper had been so clear, so specific. Appendix D, subsection 11B, the legacy provision. It's been changed. It wasn't a vague warning. It was a precise, actionable piece of intelligence. Who was she? How could a waitress possibly know the internal structure of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition agreement? His first instinct was corporate espionage, a plant from a rival firm, a disgruntled employee. But her face, when he caught a glimpse of it as she turned away, held no malice, only a profound, desperate sincerity and fear. He was a man who had built his empire on judging character, on reading the subtle cues people gave off in high-stakes negotiations. Her fear felt genuine. He looked at his own lawyer, Robert Henshaw. Robert had been with him for 30 years. He was a good lawyer, but he was also 70, comfortable, and perhaps too trusting. He had accepted the assurances from Skadden Arps that the final draft only contained minor housekeeping changes from the version they had approved weeks ago. It was standard practice in deals of this size not to relitigate every single line item at the 11th hour. Trust was the lubricant of commerce. But what if that trust had been betrayed? Arthur Stryker pressed his voice, losing a fraction of its smoothness. The champagne is getting warm. Arthur Sterling raised a hand, a placating gesture that held an unmistakable command. He gave a small, self-deprecating chuckle, a performance honed over decades in boardrooms. Forgive me, Damien, a senior moment. 72 years have a way of catching up to you. There was just one small detail Martha always harped on about. A legacy, she called it. He turned his tired blue eyes on Robert Henshaw. Robert, humor an old man. Let's have another look at the employee pension provisions, the legacy clauses we worked so hard on. Just to be certain. Robert Henshaw blinked, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before being replaced by professional deference. Arthur, we've been over this. It's ironclad. Scadden confirmed the language mirrors our last red line. I'm sure it does. Arthur said, his voice gentle but firm. But my late wife's ghost is nagging me. Let's just call it a final tribute to her memory. Where are those provisions located again? One of the junior lawyers from Stryker's team. A nervous young man with slicked-back hair spoke up. That would be in Appendix D, sir. The Asset Realignment Protocol. The name hit Arthur like a cold slap. Asset Realignment Protocol. That wasn't what he and Robert had called it. They had called it the Sterling Legacy Provision. It was a small change, but in the world of law, the name of a thing was often the key to its true purpose. The waitress had used the old name. Stryker shot the young lawyer a venomous glare that made the man physically recoil. He then turned back to Arthur, his smile back in place, but it didn't reach his eyes. A new name for a new era, Arthur. A more dynamic, forward-facing term. The spirit of the provision is entirely unchanged, I assure you. I'm sure it is. Arthur repeated the words, now laced with ice. But I find myself in a pedantic mood. Please, Robert, read it for us. Appendix D, subsection 11B. Wasn't it? He looked pointedly at the nervous junior lawyer, who nodded mutely. The request hung in the air, a flagrant breach of deal-closing etiquette. To scrutinize a minor subsection at the signing table was an insult. It implied a lack of trust so profound it could derail the entire process. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The lawyers from Scadden Arps exchanged uneasy glances. Damien Stryker's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed in his cheek. Robert Henshaw, flustered, began shuffling through the massive document. It will take a moment to find Arthur. It's a dense document. We have time, Arthur said calmly, leaning back in his chair. He folded his hands over his stomach and fixed his gaze on Damien Stryker. It was a look he had used to break union bosses and bring arrogant suppliers to heel. A look of infinite, patient power. While the lawyer's scrambled Arthur's mind was on the waitress, he needed to speak with her. He needed to know how she knew. He caught the eye of the maitre d', who had been hovering nervously near the door, and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod towards the direction the waitress had gone. It was a gesture that said, "Find her. Keep her here." Do it quietly, the maitre d', a professional accustomed to the silent commands of the powerful, simply bowed his head and vanished. The game had changed. The signing was no longer a formality. It was now a hunt, and Arthur Sterling, the old lion, who everyone thought was ready to retire to the savannah, had just caught the scent of blood. While Robert Henshaw and his team frantically leafed through the contract, creating a rustle of paper that sounded like dry leaves in the tense silence, Arthur excused himself. "A glass of water for an old man's throat," he announced, pushing his chair back. "Don't start the party without me." Stryker watched him go, his expression a mask of controlled fury. The moment Arthur was out of the room, he turned to his lead counsel. "What the hell is in 11B?" He hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. Arthur ignored the frantic energy behind him. Guided by the discreet maitre d', he was led not doucement to the men's room, but down a service corridor, a stark, sterile world away from the luxury of the pinnacle room. The air here smelled of bleach and cooking grease. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Leaning against a stainless steel food warmer, looking pale and terrified, was the waitress, Chloe Jensen. The maitre d' gave a nod. She was on her way to the locker room, Mr. Sterling. "I told her you wished to compliment her on the service." He then melted back into the shadows, leaving them alone. Chloe stood straighter, her hands clenched at her sides. She was preparing to be fired, or worse. Arthur stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her closely for the first time. She was young, maybe 25, with intelligent eyes that held a mixture of fear and defiance. Her uniform was cheap polyester, but she wore it with a kind of dignity. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice quiet, without a trace of anger. "Chloe. Chloe Jensen, sir." "Chloe," he repeated softly. "You took a very big risk in there." She swallowed hard. "I know, sir." "Why?" It was a simple question, but the answer was everything. Chloe took a breath, deciding to tell the unvarnished truth. There was no point in lying to a man like Arthur Sterling. "I'm a law student, sir, at NYU. Second year," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I work here to pay tuition. I also do freelance document review for a temp agency that services big law firms. It's mostly grunt work, but it pays well." Arthur's eyes sharpened with interest. This was no random act of sabotage. This was a professional opinion. "A few weeks ago, Chloe continued, my agency had me on a project for Skaden Arps, codename Project Legacy. I spent 2 nights reviewing the acquisition agreement. Your agreement. I read the original Sterling Legacy provision. It was a good clause, sir. It protected everyone. It was clear you cared about your people." A flicker of emotion crossed Arthur's face. Martha had helped him draft the spirit of that clause. Then last night I was assigned to a final review. Small changes, they said. But the name had been changed to the Asset Realignment Protocol. I knew that was a red flag. I read it again. The language was deceptive. They twisted it. They added loopholes you could drive a truck through. The 25-year pension guarantee became an 18-month review period. The layoff protections were gone, replaced by a restructuring clause. They added a new subsection 11B that gave the new owners the right to terminate the defined benefits pension plan entirely and seize the surplus assets after converting it to a basic 401k. She looked him straight in the eye, the fear in her own being eclipsed by the force of her conviction. They didn't just change it, Mr. Sterling. They gutted it. They turned a shield into a sword. And they hid it behind 100 pages of boilerplate. They were counting on no one rereading the whole thing at the last minute. They were counting on you, trusting them. The corridor was silent, save for the hum of the lights. Arthur Sterling stood motionless, processing her words. She had not only identified the change, but had articulated the malicious intent behind it with the clarity of a seasoned lawyer. Seizing the surplus assets of a pension fund, it was a classic predatory private equity move. It could net Vanguard an extra $500 million money stolen from the retirement funds of his employees. He felt a cold, creeping rage, followed by a profound sense of shame. He had almost let this happen. He had been so focused on the finish line, so tired of the fight, that he had nearly betrayed the very people who had built his company alongside him. This young woman, a stranger, had shown more loyalty to the spirit of Sterling Industries in one whispered sentence than his own legal team had in months of negotiation. He looked at Chloe, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt the fog of his grief and weariness begin to lift, replaced by the old familiar fire of purpose. "You said you are a student at NYU. Law?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "What do you intend to do after you graduate?" Chloe blinked, thrown by the question. I hope to work in corporate law, sir. Maybe in-house counsel somewhere. If I haven't just completely torpedoed my career." Arthur Sterling allowed himself a small, grim smile. "On the contrary, Miss Jensen," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. "I think your career has just begun." He turned to head back to the dining room. "Wait here for me. Don't go anywhere. The performance is about to begin, and I want you to have a front row seat." When Arthur Sterling re-entered the Pinnacle Room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Robert Henshaw was sweating, dabbing his forehead with a silk pocket square as he stood over a page in the document, his face pale. Damian Stryker and his team of lawyers stood in a tight, whispering knot, their predatory confidence replaced by a frantic, cornered energy. They all stopped and looked up as Arthur closed the door behind him. Arthur walked calmly back to his seat, the picture of a man unburdened by any care in the world. He sat down and looked expectantly at his lawyer. "Well, Robert?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Did you find the section? Was my old memory playing tricks on me?" Robert Henshaw cleared his throat, unable to meet his client's gaze. He looked down at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. Yes, Arthur. I've found it. Appendix D subsection 11B. Excellent. Arthur beamed, though his eyes were chips of ice. Read it aloud for all of us. I'm sure it's just the same noble language we drafted, perhaps phrased a little differently. For the sake of synergy, he shot the last word at Stryker like a poisoned dart. Stryker took a step forward. "Arthur, this is highly irregular. It's an insult to the integrity of my legal team and your own. This is a standard clause designed to provide operational flexibility in a modern business environment. Is it?" Arthur replied, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Then you should have no objection to hearing it read aloud. Unless, of course, the operational flexibility you're referring to is the flexibility to plunder the pensions of men and women who have given their entire lives to this company." The accusation, raw and direct, struck the room dumb. The pretense of civility was shattered. Now Robert Arthur commanded his voice like steel. "Read." With trembling hands, Robert Henshaw began to read. The language was convoluted, a thicket of legal jargon, but its meaning became chillingly clear as he spoke. The acquiring party reserves the right following: an 18-month transitional period to initiate a comprehensive review of all defined benefit obligations. In the event of a planned termination, all surplus assets exceeding the minimum statutory funding requirements shall revert to the parent company for the purposes of capital reallocation and debt servicing. He trailed off, his voice hoarse. He didn't need to read any more. Everyone in the room understood. It was a license to steal written on company letterhead. Robert looked up at Arthur, his face a mask of horror and professional shame. "Arthur, I never saw this. It wasn't in the draft we approved. They must have slipped it into the final executable copy." They assured us the changes were cosmetic. Arthur ignored him, his gaze locked on Damien Stryker. The younger man's handsome face was now a tight, bloodless mask of fury. The charm had evaporated, revealing the cold predator beneath. "A clever piece of writing," Arthur said softly, the words dripping with contempt. "My compliments to your lawyers at Skadden Arps. They certainly earned their exorbitant fees. Tell me, Damien, was this your plan all along? Buy my company with my own employees' pension money. How very efficient." Stryker finally broke. "This is business, Arthur. Not a charity. That fund is overfunded by nearly $1 billion. It's a wasted asset on the balance sheet. Your sentimentality is why this company, for all its history, is undervalued. We are here to unlock that value." "Unlock value!" Arthur roared, slamming his hand on the table. The crystal glasses jumped and rang. For the first time, the old lion let out his full voice, a sound of righteous fury that made everyone in the room flinch. "You call theft unlocking value. You stand in this room and talk about balance sheets, but you forget that those assets are the years of sweat and loyalty from thousands of people. They are the promise of a dignified old age for a machinist in Detroit, a line worker in Cleveland, a secretary in Pittsburgh who trusted me. They trusted the name Sterling." He stood up, his full height, seeming to diminish every other person in the room. He reached for the signature page of the contract. Stryker watched a flicker of hope in his eyes, thinking perhaps Arthur would sign it anyway, that the money would win out. Instead, Arthur Sterling took the page in his 2 hands. With deliberate, satisfying force, he tore it cleanly in half. Then he tore it again, and again. He let the pieces of the $11 billion deal flutter from his fingers onto the center of the obsidian table like bitter confetti. "There is no deal," he said, his voice now dangerously quiet. "Get out of my sight." For a moment, no one moved. Then Stryker, his face contorted with rage, pointed a trembling finger at Arthur. "You'll regret this, old man. I'll have my lawyers bury you. We have a signed letter of intent. You can't just walk away." Arthur smiled, a truly terrifying sight. "Your lawyers," he said. "My first call will not be to my lawyers. It will be to the Attorney General of New York and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I imagine they'll be very interested in a case of attempted fraud of this magnitude. And then I'll call the Wall Street Journal. Your firm Vanguard Equity and your partners at Skadden Arps are about to become very, very famous." The threat was devastating and absolute. Stryker's face went white. The careers and reputations of everyone on his side of the table flashed before their eyes. In a flurry of panicked whispers and slammed briefcases, they scrambled out of the room. A defeated army in full retreat. Arthur Sterling stood alone at the head of the table, the pieces of the broken deal before him. His own legal team looked at him with a mixture of awe and terror. He had just walked away from $11 billion. But Arthur Sterling didn't feel like he had lost a thing. He felt like he had just won back his soul. The silence that descended upon the Pinnacle Room after Stryker's chaotic exit was a physical entity heavier and more profound than the soundproofed walls could ever create on their own. It was a vacuum filled with the ghosts of $11 billion and the sharp metallic tang of shattered trust. Arthur Sterling's own team, his lawyers, his bankers, stood frozen, looking like shipwreck survivors on a desolate shore. The magnificent view of Central Park seemed to mock them, a serene, indifferent witness to the corporate carnage. On the obsidian table, the torn pieces of the contract lay scattered, what Arthur had called bitter confetti, a testament to a future that had just been violently unwritten. Robert Henshaw, his face the color of old parchment, took a shaky step towards Arthur. The professional mask he had worn for 40 years had crumbled, revealing the terrified, deeply ashamed man beneath. This wasn't just a failed deal. It was the nadir of his entire career, a catastrophic failure of his most fundamental duty to his client, his friend. Arthur, he began, his voice cracking thick with a lifetime of unspoken loyalty. There are no words, no excuses. I failed you. I got lazy. I trusted their reputation, their assurances. Skadden Arps. You don't expect a firm like that to engage in back-alley fraud. He gestured helplessly at the torn papers. I should have read every line myself, even if it took all night. I should have. Martha would never have let me get away with such carelessness. The invocation of his late wife's name struck Arthur, but not with the sting Robert might have expected. Instead, it brought a strange clarity. He looked at his old friend, seeing not a traitor, but a reflection of his own fatigue. We both got complacent, Robert. Arthur said, his voice surprisingly gentle, devoid of the thunder he had unleashed on Stryker. The rage had burned away, leaving a core of cold, hard purpose. We both started thinking about the end of the story, instead of paying attention to the chapter we were in. We forgot that the world is full of hungry wolves, and they love nothing more than a sleeping lion. He placed a hand on Robert's shoulder, a gesture of weary forgiveness. This isn't on you alone. It's on me for wanting it to be over. But it's not over. It's just beginning. His gaze shifted to the grand door. He had a new general for this new war, and it was time for her enlistment. He caught the eye of the maitre d', who still hovered nervously in the doorway, and gave a simple, clear nod. Please send Miss Jensen in. A moment later, Chloe entered the room. If she had felt overwhelmed before, she now looked like a lone foot soldier, wandering onto the command deck of a battleship after a major battle. She took in the scene, the stunned, powerful men, the august, silent room, and the billionaire who stood at the center of the storm, looking not diminished but somehow larger, more vital than before. Her eyes fell to the destroyed contract, and she felt a fresh wave of terror mixed with a bewildering sense of vindication. Arthur gestured for her to approach the table, his demeanor calm and reassuring. He swept the torn pieces of paper into a small, neat pile, a symbolic clearing of the old, corrupt foundation. He looked at her, his tired blue eyes now holding a spark she hadn't seen before, a flicker of the brilliant, incisive mind that had built an empire. Miss Jensen. He began, his voice resonating with a quiet authority that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. In my 50 years in business, I have encountered thousands of lawyers, bankers, and consultants. I have paid them fees that could fund a small nation, all for their supposedly expert advice. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over his own shell-shocked team before returning it to her. Yet, today, the most valuable, the most crucial piece of counsel I received came not from a senior partner at Sullivan & Cromwell, but from a law student at NYU, working a double shift to pay her tuition. He continued, "Courage is a rare commodity, Ms. Jensen, but courage combined with integrity and intelligence that is nearly extinct. Most people would have stayed silent. They would have weighed the personal risk against a problem that wasn't theirs and chosen the path of least resistance. They would have protected themselves. Why didn't you?" The question was genuine, his curiosity profound. Chloe swallowed, finding her voice in the cavernous silence. My grandfather worked for Bethlehem Steel his whole life. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice steady. He was promised a pension, a secure retirement. When a private equity firm bought the company in the 90s, they used legal loopholes very similar to the ones I saw in your contract to gut that pension fund. He lost almost everything. He died thinking he had failed his family. I saw that clause and I didn't see legal language. I saw my grandfather's face. I couldn't just serve water and walk away. A deep, knowing sadness touched Arthur's eyes. He nodded slowly. So you understand. You understand that this is not about numbers on a page. It's about people. It's about promises. He straightened up, a new energy coursing through him. I find myself in a unique position. I have just summarily dismissed my M&A advisors and have lost considerable faith in my long-time legal counsel's oversight. And I still own a multi-billion-dollar company that it appears is in desperate need of a moral and ethical immune system. It needs a new generation of leadership, one whose compass is fixed on true north, not magnetic north, which wavers depending on where the money is. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. I am creating a new position. It will report directly to me, and only to me. A director of corporate integrity. This person will be my eyes and ears, an internal watchdog, with the authority to review any contract question, any initiative, and veto any proposal that violates the spirit of this company. They will be a guardian of our principles. It's a position that requires a spine of steel, a brilliant legal mind, and an incorruptible character. He held her gaze. I would like to offer that position to you. Chloe's mind went blank. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She heard the words, but they didn't compute. Director, report to him. It was an absurd, impossible fantasy. Mr. Sterling, I'm a student, she stammered, the same protest as before, but it felt even more inadequate now. I'm flattered, but I'm not qualified. I haven't even passed the bar exam. You have passed a far more important test today, Ms. Jensen, Arthur said firmly, waving away her objection. As for the rest, it's a matter of logistics. Sterling Industries will immediately pay off your existing student debt in full. We will of course cover every cent of your remaining tuition and expenses at NYU. You will be placed on the executive payroll effective immediately at a salary that will put you in the top percentile of law school graduates. You can work part-time as your studies allow and transition to full-time the day after you pass the bar. He wasn't finished. Your first assignment, he added, a grim smile touching his lips, will be to assist me in finding a new law firm. A pack of bulldogs, not the pampered poodles we've been using. You will help me vet them, interview them, and prepare the litigation we will now be pursuing against Vanguard Equity Partners for fraudulent inducement. You will be in the room for every meeting. It was a complete, overwhelming, life-altering vision of a future she could never have conceived. The crushing weight of her loans, the constant anxiety of making rent, the fear that she would spend her life as a cog in a machine, she despised it all, evaporated in an instant. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. But this time she didn't fight them. They were tears of shock, of relief, of a profound and staggering gratitude. Say yes, Ms. Jensen, Arthur prompted gently. She took a deep, steadying breath, and for the first time she smiled a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her face. Yes, Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice clear and strong. Yes. I accept. Arthur Sterling extended his hand across the obsidian table over the ruins of the broken deal. Chloe reached out and took it. Her grip was firm, her hand steady. Their handshake was not the perfunctory, bloodless ritual of the corporate world. It was the sealing of a new contract, one not written on paper, but forged in principle. It was a promise to build a better, more honorable future for Sterling Industries. A future where the legacy of a man like Chloe's grandfather would be protected, not plundered. 1 year later, Arthur Sterling stood before the same floor-to-ceiling windows in his corner office. The panoramic view of Central Park, a sea of green and gold under the autumn sun, was unchanged. But the man looking out at it was a different person entirely forged anew in the crucible of the year that had passed. The weariness that had settled deep in his bones, the quiet grief that had clouded his judgment, was gone. In its place was a formidable clarity, a rediscovered sense of purpose that made him feel more alive at 73 than he had at 60. The year since the disastrous signing in the Pinnacle Room had not been quiet. It had been a war. Following Chloe's advice on her very first assignment, they had not retained a massive established law firm. Instead, they hired a boutique litigation firm out of Chicago, known for its scorched earth tactics and its utter fearlessness in taking on corporate giants. They were the bulldogs he had asked for, and they had been unleashed. The lawsuit filed against Vanguard Equity Partners and Skadden Arps was a masterpiece of legal aggression, accusing them not just of breach of contract, but of conspiracy to commit fraud. Chloe, while still attending her final year of law school, became an indispensable part of the legal team. Her meticulous notes from her time as a temp reviewer, once dismissed by her supervisor, became Exhibit A in the preliminary hearings. She sat beside Arthur during the brutal hours-long depositions, her sharp memory and quick mind often catching Stryker's lawyers in subtle contradictions, earning her the grudging respect of their own legal counsel. The public front of the war was just as ferocious. The Wall Street Journal story had landed like a bomb in the financial world. Titled The Billion-Dollar Betrayal, it detailed the plot to plunder the Sterling Pension Fund, casting Damien Stryker as a modern-day robber baron and Arthur Sterling as the old guard industrialist, making a final stand for his people. The narrative was powerful and clear, thanks to a series of carefully managed interviews with Arthur, who, guided by Chloe, framed the fight not as a deal gone wrong, but as a battle for the soul of American capitalism. The SEC investigation that followed was swift and damning, and within 6 months, Damien Stryker had resigned in disgrace, his golden reputation irrevocably tarnished. Vanguard Equity Partners, facing an exodus of investors and a mountain of legal fees, settled with Sterling Industries for an undisclosed but reputedly staggering sum. But the true revolution wasn't happening in the courtroom or the newspapers. It was happening inside the walls of Sterling Industries itself. Arthur, galvanized by his near-catastrophic mistake, had turned his full attention back to the company he had been so ready to abandon. With Chloe acting as his strategic advisor and moral compass, he didn't just save the company, he remade it. The $2 billion modernization plan was rolled out not as a cost-cutting measure, but as an investment in his workforce. In the Ohio plant, state-of-the-art robotic arms now worked alongside veteran machinists who had been retrained in programming and diagnostics, their decades of experience now more valuable than ever. The new profit-sharing program, initially met with deep skepticism by the union, had silenced all doubters when the first checks were distributed. For the first time, a line worker in Detroit saw a direct reward for the company's success, fostering a sense of shared ownership that no corporate memo ever could. And in honor of his late wife, Arthur had established the Martha Sterling Memorial Scholarship Fund an endowment that would pay for the college education of employees' children for generations to come. Through it all, Chloe's transformation had been nothing short of meteoric. She had juggled the immense pressure of her new role with the final grueling months of law school. There were nights she'd leave a tense strategy session with the lawyers at 10 p.m., only to spend the next 4 hours studying for her corporate finance exam. She graduated, as predicted, at the very top of her class. The day she was sworn into the New York bar, Arthur had closed the entire executive floor and held a reception in her honor. Her office was now next to his, a spacious room with warm walnut furniture and the same breathtaking view. It was a world away from her cramped apartment, and she never forgot it. She had become Arthur's most trusted confidant. He valued her sharp, legal mind, but he treasured her perspective even more. She saw the company not as a collection of assets, but as a community of people, and her influence was felt in every major decision. She had quietly but firmly vetoed a plan to switch to a cheaper health insurance provider, and had championed a new policy for paid parental leave, arguing successfully that stable families made for a stable workforce. On this particular afternoon, she walked into Arthur's office holding a folder. She had the same quiet dignity as the day he first met her, but now it was layered with a calm, earned confidence. "Good news," she said, her smile bright. The board just gave final approval for the new childcare initiative. The plans for the on-site centers at the 3 largest plants are being drawn up now. We should be able to break ground by spring. Arthur turned from the window, a genuine smile spreading across his face. The initiative had been Chloe's passion project for the last 6 months. She had built the case for it with impeccable data, showing how it would reduce employee absenteeism and increase retention among young parents. But her winning argument had been a moral one. "We can't call ourselves a family company," she had told the board, "if we force our employees to choose between their careers and their children." He took the folder and looked at the preliminary designs. Then he looked at Chloe. "You fought for this. The CFO said it was an unnecessary expense. You changed his mind. You changed all their minds. I had a good teacher," she replied, her gaze meeting his. "Someone who taught me that the best arguments come from the heart, but they need to be backed up by the facts. Besides, I just showed them the letters." She tapped the folder. Tucked inside were dozens of emails she had collected from employees, mothers and fathers who spoke of the daily struggle to find affordable, reliable childcare. Arthur nodded, a profound sense of peace settling over him. He had spent his life building a legacy of steel and industry, of market share and profit margins. He had been ready to sign it all away, to encase that legacy in the amber of a financial transaction. But Chloe's whisper had shattered the amber. It had forced him to see that a legacy isn't a monument you build and leave behind. It is a living thing that must be tended to, that must evolve and grow and breathe. The new sterling legacy was not just about him anymore. It was about the profit-sharing check that helped a family afford their first home. It was about the scholarship that sent a machinist's daughter to medical school. It was about the on-site daycare that would allow a young mother to advance in her career without sacrificing time with her child. He hadn't sold his company. He had given it a new soul. And in Chloe Jensen, the waitress who had risked everything for a principle, he had found the perfect guardian to ensure that soul would never again be put up for sale. And so Arthur Sterling didn't just walk away from a deal. He walked back to the principles that built his empire in the first place. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true value isn't always found in an $11 billion price tag. Sometimes it's found in the courage of one person who dares to speak truth to power, even in a whisper. Chloe Jensen didn't just save a company. She resurrected its soul, and in doing so forged her own incredible destiny. Her story shows that your current position doesn't define your potential impact. What did you think of Chloe's incredible bravery? Have you ever had a gut feeling that something was wrong and decided to speak up? Share your own experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories of courage, big or small. If this story of integrity, triumphing over greed, resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that one voice can make a difference. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story that will inspire and surprise you. Thanks for listening. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to everything, a stark contrast to the Chanel No. 5 that usually perfumed her world. Cordelia Hayes drifted in a sea of anesthesia. The last memory she held dear, being her husband's kiss, a promise whispered against her temple. "I'll be right here when you open your eyes." He was her rock, the celebrated tech millionaire Richard Sterling. But when her eyelids fluttered open, the man in the bespoke suit sitting vigil was not her husband. He was a stranger, with eyes like polished obsidian, and the promise Richard made was the first of many lies to unravel. The view from the penthouse was Richard Sterling's favorite party trick. From the 72nd floor of their 157 apartment Central Park, sprawled below like a manicured green carpet, a perfect rectangle of nature hemmed in by the relentless ambition of Manhattan. He loved to stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of Macallan 25 in hand, and gesture to the city as if he'd personally arranged every skyscraper. "We made it." Cora, he'd say, his arm wrapping securely around Cordelia's waist, his chin resting on her hair. Top of the world. To Cordelia, it often felt less like the top of the world, and more like a beautifully appointed cage. The apartment was a symphony of minimalist luxury, gleaming marble floors, artfully distressed concrete walls, and furniture that looked more like sculpture than something a person could comfortably sit on. It was Rick's taste, curated by a designer he'd poached from a rival billionaire. Cordelia's own touch was confined to the small library, where worn paperbacks and her collection of antique maps felt wonderfully rebelliously out of place. Their life to the outside world was an object of intense envy, a modern fairy tale chronicled in the glossy pages of Vanity Fair and Forbes. Richard Sterling, the wunderkind CEO of Sterling Innovations, had disrupted the data security industry with his proprietary algorithm Aegis. He was handsome, charismatic, and by all accounts utterly devoted to his lovely wife Cordelia, a former art historian he'd met at a gallery fundraiser. Now, 6 months pregnant with their first child, Cordelia felt the gilded bars of her cage pressing in. The pregnancy had been difficult, categorized as high risk from the start due to a rare placental condition. Their son, whom they'd already named Arthur, was a fighter, but his very survival depended on a groundbreaking in utero surgery scheduled for the following week at Lenox Hill Hospital. Dr. Anya Sharma, the best fetal surgeon in the country, had been flown in from the Mayo Clinic. Rick had spared no expense, a fact he mentioned often. "Only the best for my boy," he'd declared, signing off on the astronomical private medical fees without a second glance. "And for my wife." He was the perfect concerned husband. He massaged her swollen ankles, catered to her late-night cravings for pickles, and mango sorbet, and held her when the anxiety became a physical weight on her chest. Yet lately there were fissures in his perfect facade, hairline cracks that only she seemed to notice. There were the phone calls. He would take them in his home office, the heavy sound-proofed door clicking shut behind him. His voice, usually so warm and resonant, would drop to a low, clipped murmur. When he emerged, his smile would be a little too bright, his posture a little too rigid. "Just business, honey," he'd say, kissing her forehead, putting out fires. The usual. The fires seemed to be raging more often. The company was on the verge of a massive public offering, and he claimed the pressure was immense. Then there was the matter of Zara Vance. She was his new COO, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman with an MBA from Wharton and an unnerving intensity in her gaze. Cordelia had met her a few times at company events. Zara was all professional deference to her face, but Cordelia had caught the way she looked at Rick when she thought no one was watching, a look of possessive familiarity that went far beyond the boardroom. Cordelia had once brought it up gently. "Zara seems very dedicated to you," she'd ventured. Rick had laughed it off. "She's dedicated to the company, Cora. She's a killer, and I need that right now. Don't let your hormones make you paranoid." The word paranoid stung a casual dismissal that made her feel foolish and small. She let it go. She had to trust him. Trust was the foundation of their marriage, the bedrock beneath the dizzying heights of their life. The night before the surgery, a storm broke over the city, lashing rain against the vast windows. Rick was packing a small leather carry-on. "I hate this timing, I really do." He set his back to her. "This meeting in Geneva is non-negotiable. The Swiss consortium is our biggest potential investor for the IPO. I have to be there to close it." Cordelia's heart sank. "You're leaving tonight." He turned his face a mask of remorse. "My flight is at dawn. I'll be back in 48 hours tops. I promise. I'll be on the first plane back the second the papers are signed. I'll call the hospital the moment I land. Dr. Sharma knows the situation." He knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. His hands were always so warm. "My heart will be right here with you and Arthur. Every second." Something cold snaked around her own heart. "Rick, please." "Can't it wait? Just 2 days, if I don't go. The deal collapses." He said, his voice firm but gentle. "This is for us, Cora. For our future. For Arthur's future. So he never has to worry about a single thing." He framed her face with his hands, his blue eyes earnest and compelling. "I love you more than anything. You know that, right?" She nodded, swallowing the lump of fear in her throat. He was right. He was building an empire for them. This was the price of that empire. She was being selfish. Later that night, as he slept beside her, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up for a fleeting second. Cordelia, awake with a mixture of nerves and discomfort, saw the preview of the message. It was from Zara Vance. "Everything is in place. Wheels up at 6 a.m. See you on the other side. See you on the other side." It sounded so final, so ominous. Cordelia's breath hitched, but then she rationalized it away. Of course, Zara was going to Geneva with him. She was the COO. It was a business trip. On the other side meant after the deal was done. Her mind, frayed by anxiety, was inventing conspiracies. She curled up against her husband's back, willing herself to believe in the man she loved, the man who had promised to build their world brick by gilded brick. She closed her eyes and prayed for the morning for the surgery to be a success, and for the safe return of the man who was her entire world. The morning arrived grey and sullen, the city shrouded in a damp mist that mirrored the fog in Cordelia's mind. The ride to Lenox Hill was silent, the plush interior of the Rolls-Royce suddenly feeling claustrophobic. Rick held her hand, his thumb tracing soothing circles on her skin, but his attention was elsewhere. He kept glancing at his Patek Philippe watch, a nervous energy thrumming just beneath his calm exterior. "You'll be great, Cora. You're the strongest person I know," he murmured, as they pulled up to the private entrance of the hospital's maternity wing, an entrance reserved for those who measured their privacy in dollars. "I wish you were staying," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know." "God." "I know," he said, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine regret. "I'll be watching my phone. Your mom will be here soon, and Alistair will be in the waiting room." Alistair Finch was Rick's personal lawyer, a stoic man who had been with him since the beginning. His presence seemed an odd choice for a hospital vigil, but Rick had insisted he be there to handle any and all paperwork, just in case. Inside a private suite that looked more like a room at the Four Seasons was waiting for her. Nurses bustled around with quiet efficiency. Cordelia changed into a standard-issue hospital gown that felt rough against her skin, a humbling piece of cotton in a world of cashmere and silk. The anesthesiologist, a kind-faced man named Dr. Evans, came in to explain the procedure. He spoke of epidurals and general anesthesia in a calm, reassuring tone. But his words swam in Cordelia's ears. All she could focus on was the rhythmic beat of the fetal heart monitor, the steady thump, thump, thump that was her son's life force, her anchor. Rick stayed until the very last moment. When the orderly arrived with the gurney, he leaned down and kissed her a long, lingering press of his lips against hers. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "Fight for our boy. I'll be on a plane before you even wake up. I'll be right here." He touched her cheek, his gaze intense. "I promise." That was the last she saw of him. His handsome face, etched with concern, framed in the doorway, before he turned and walked away, his confident stride never faltering. The journey to the operating theatre was a blur of fluorescent lights and sterile corridors. She was transferred to the operating table, a narrow, cold surface in the center of a room, filled with gleaming steel and complex machinery. Faces in blue scrubs and masks hovered above her, their eyes kind but distant. Dr. Sharma, a woman with a formidable reputation and surprisingly gentle hands, gave her arm a reassuring squeeze. "We're going to take very good care of you and Arthur Cordelia," she said. "Just relax and count backward from 100. Dr. Evans fitted a mask over her face. The scent of antiseptic plastic filled her nostrils. 100. She began, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Her thoughts drifted back to Rick, his promise. "I'll be right here." She pictured him boarding his private jet at Teterboro, settling into a cream leather seat, perhaps already on a conference call with the Swiss consortium. She pictured him landing in Geneva, the crisp mountain air, the swift closing of a deal that would secure their future forever. She pictured him racing back his heart with her, just as he said. 99. The operating room was a hive of controlled activity. Dr. Sharma and her team worked with the precision of master watchmakers. The surgery was a marvel of modern medicine, a minimally invasive procedure that involved making a tiny incision in the uterus to reach the placenta and correct the vascular issue that was threatening Arthur's growth. Every movement was guided by high-resolution ultrasound. Every vital sign monitored on a bank of screens that beeped and flashed in a steady, life-affirming rhythm. Hours passed. The team worked tirelessly navigating the delicate microscopic world of an unborn child. They were fighting for 2 lives, a battle waged with scalpels no bigger than an eyelash and sutures as fine as silk. Outside, the sterile bubble of the OR life went on. In the waiting room, Cordelia's mother Helen wrung her hands, sipping lukewarm coffee, while Alistair Finch sat stiffly in a chair, checking his phone with grim regularity, his face unreadable. Back in the operating room, Dr. Sharma made the final, crucial repair. A collective muted sigh of relief went through the team. Closure, she commanded, her voice calm but triumphant. The most dangerous part was over. Mother and child were stable. The long night was coming to an end. 98. Cordelia whispered in the depths of her unconscious mind. She was in their apartment. Rick was there, holding a tiny baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Arthur. He was smiling, his familiar, dazzling smile. "See Cora," he said, his voice echoing as if in a vast chamber. "I told you everything would be fine. I'm right here." He leaned in to kiss her, but his face began to distort, the features melting like wax. His smile twisted into a sneer. The baby in his arms vanished. The penthouse walls dissolved, replaced by an endless, empty darkness. A cold, terrifying void opened up beneath her, and she was falling. 97. A single tear escaped her closed eye and traced a path down her temple as the drugs held her fast in their chemical embrace, blissfully unaware that the promise, the man, and the world she knew were already gone. The longest night of her life was not the one spent on the operating table, but the one that was just beginning to dawn. Consciousness returned not as a sudden jolt, but as a slow, creeping tide. It began with an awareness of sound, the soft, rhythmic beep of a machine, the distant murmur of voices, the whisper of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. Then came sensation, the dull, throbbing ache in her abdomen, the scratchiness of the sheets, the dry, papery feel of her own tongue. Cordelia's eyelids were heavy, glued shut with the residue of sleep and anesthesia. She forced them open, blinking against the muted afternoon light, filtering through the blinds of her private room. The first thing she saw was the IV stand beside her bed, clear bags dripping fluid into a tube taped to her hand. The second thing she saw was the empty chair beside her bed. The chair where Rick was supposed to be. A flutter of panic, swift and sharp, pierced through the fog in her brain. "Rick," she croaked, her voice a rough, unused thing. A nurse she hadn't seen before, a kind-faced woman with her name Seraphina Croft embroidered on her scrubs, bustled in. "Mrs. Sterling, you're awake. That's wonderful. How are you feeling?" "Where's my husband?" Cordelia asked, her voice gaining a little strength. "And the baby is Arthur. Is he okay?" The nurse's smile was warm and immediate. The surgery was a complete success. A textbook case. "Your son is a little champion. He's stable and resting in the NICU. You can see him as soon as you're feeling a bit stronger." Relief washed over Cordelia so intensely, it left her dizzy. Arthur was safe. The nightmare was over. But the relief was instantly soured by the persistent gnawing question. "My husband? Richard? He was supposed to be here. Did he call his flight from Geneva?" Nurse Croft's professional smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. She busied herself checking Cordelia's vitals, her movements a little too deliberate. "Your mother was here all morning. She just stepped out to get some lunch. She said to tell you she loves you." But Rick Cordelia insisted, trying to push herself up on her elbows. A sharp pain shot through her abdomen, and she gasped, falling back against the pillows. He promised he'd be here. "Just rest, Mrs. Sterling," the nurse said, her tone gentle but evasive. "The doctor will be in to see you shortly. Let's get you some ice chips for your throat." She scurried out of the room, leaving Cordelia alone with the beeping machine and the deafening silence from the empty chair. Panic began to coil in her stomach, again cold and heavy. Something was wrong. The nurse's evasion, the careful way she avoided the question, it wasn't normal. Rick would have moved heaven and earth to be here. He would have called 100 times. He would have sent flowers, an avalanche of them. The room was stark, devoid of any personal touch, save for the overnight bag her mother had packed for her. She fumbled for the call button, her fingers weak and clumsy. Her mind raced through 1,000 terrifying possibilities. The plane. Was there an accident? A mechanical failure? Was he hurt? Was he... No. She couldn't let her mind go there. A few minutes later, the door opened again, but it wasn't her mother or the doctor. It was a man she had never seen before. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that whispered of Savile Row and old money. His hair was a distinguished salt and pepper, his features sharp and patrician. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, closing the door softly behind him. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a cool, startling grey like a winter sky, and they regarded her with an unnerving, analytical calm. He looked completely out of place in the cheerful hospital room. He walked over to the empty chair, Rick's chair, and sat down, placing a slim leather briefcase on the floor beside him. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself. He simply sat, his hands resting on his knees, and watched her. Cordelia stared back, a mixture of fear and confusion churning within her. Who are you?" she managed to ask. "Are you from the airline? Is my husband? Is Richard okay?" The man's expression remained unchanged. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and measured a baritone that seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. "Richard is not on a plane, Mrs. Sterling. He never went to Geneva." The words hung in the air, nonsensical. "What are you talking about?" Of course he did. He had a meeting with the Swiss consortium. Her voice trailed off as she saw the absolute certainty in his gaze. He wasn't lying. He wasn't mistaken. "There is no Swiss consortium." The man stated each word a precise, deliberate blow. "The meeting was a fiction." "No." Cordelia whispered, shaking her head, a desperate denial rising in her throat. "You're wrong. You're mistaken." "Who are you? I want you to leave." "My name is Nathaniel Blackwood," he said, as if the name itself should explain everything. To Cordelia, it meant nothing. But the weight with which he said it implied it should. "And I'm afraid, Mrs. Sterling, that your husband is gone. He has vanished." Cordelia felt the room tilt, the steady beeping of the heart monitor, seeming to grow louder, faster, a frantic counterpoint to the blood pounding in her ears. "Vanished? What do you mean, vanished? People don't just vanish." "Did you call the police?" "We need to call the police." Nathaniel Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes pinning her to the bed. "Oh, the police are looking for him. So is the FBI. And Interpol." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. Your husband didn't just leave for a business trip, Mrs. Sterling. He ran. The world constricted to the four walls of the hospital room, to the calm, implacable face of the stranger in the chair. Cordelia's mind reeled, refusing to process his words. Interpol, the FBI. It was a nightmare, a grotesque misunderstanding. Rick Herr. Rick was a brilliant CEO, a philanthropist, a man who sat on the board of the City Ballet. He wasn't a criminal. I don't understand, she said, her voice a fragile whisper. There has to be a mistake. Rick wouldn't. Run. Nathaniel Blackwood reached down and picked up a remote control from the bedside table. With a soft click, the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall flickered to life. It was tuned to a 24-hour news network. The breaking news banner at the bottom of the screen told a story that made the air leave her lungs. Tech mogul Richard Sterling vanishes amidst massive fraud probe at Sterling Innovations. A picture of Rick smiling at a recent gala was displayed next to the anchor's grim face. Cordelia's own image flashed on the screen for a moment, a candid shot of her and Rick leaving a restaurant, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. Authorities have issued a warrant for the arrest of Richard Sterling, 38, the celebrated founder of Sterling Innovations. The anchor reported his voice crisp and professional. Sources within the SEC confirm that Sterling is the primary subject of an investigation into an alleged multi-year, multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. Sterling, along with his chief operating officer Zara Vance, is believed to have fled the country early this morning. Zara Vance. The name hit Cordelia like a physical blow. The text message. Wheels up at 6 a.m. See you on the other side. It wasn't about a business deal. It was about this. An escape. No. She breathed, her eyes fixed on the screen. No, no, no. Nathaniel muted the television, plunging the room back into a heavy silence, broken only by Cordelia's ragged breathing. He planned this, she said, the horrifying realization dawning. The surgery. He knew I'd be in surgery. It was the perfect time, the perfect alibi for his absence, the perfect cover for his disappearance. His concern, his promises, his tender goodbye kiss. All of it had been a lie, a meticulously crafted performance. He is a man of remarkable foresight. Nathaniel agreed, his tone devoid of any sympathy. It was a simple statement of fact. Why are you here? Cordelia demanded, a surge of anger cutting through her shock. Who are you to him? I am, or rather was, his primary investor. Nathaniel explained coolly. My firm, Blackwood Capital, provided the seed money that launched Sterling Innovations. I owned a 40% stake in the company, a company which, as of this morning, appears to be a hollow shell. Its assets systematically drained over the past 18 months. The puzzle pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of monstrous betrayal. Nathaniel Blackwood wasn't a harbinger of bad news. He was a victim just like her. A far wealthier, more powerful victim, but a victim nonetheless. He hadn't come out of concern for her. He had come because his world, like hers, had been upended by Richard Sterling. He took your money, she stated numbly. He took a lot of my money. Nathaniel corrected, a flicker of something hard and dangerous in his eyes, along with the money of every other person who believed in his vision. He didn't just embezzle funds, Mrs. Sterling. He fabricated earnings reports, created fictitious clients, and sold a revolutionary algorithm that my tech analysts now believe was largely vaporware. It was a brilliant, elegant, and devastatingly effective fraud. Cordelia squeezed her eyes shut, trying to reconcile the man he was describing with the man she had married. The man who read poetry to her, who knew her coffee order by heart, who had cried with joy when they first heard their son's heartbeat. How could both men be the same person? The penthouse, she whispered her thoughts, scattering. The accounts. Our money. Nathaniel's expression was grim. The apartment was leased, not owned. The lease was terminated this morning. Your joint bank accounts were emptied via a wire transfer to a Cayman Islands account at 5:47 a.m. The art, the cars, the jewelry he gifted you all purchased with stolen funds. They will be seized by federal authorities as assets in the investigation. He paused, delivering the final crushing blow. As far as the law is concerned, Mrs. Sterling, you have nothing. Less than nothing, in fact. Rick was also kind enough to leave behind a mountain of corporate debt, some of which he secured with personal guarantees that you co-signed. The room began to spin. The pain in her abdomen flared, a sharp reminder of her physical vulnerability. She had co-signed dozens of documents over the years. Loan applications, investment forms, partnership agreements. Rick had always called it a formality. Just sign here, honey. Standard procedure. She had trusted him implicitly, her pen stroking across the pages, without a second thought, sealing her own financial ruin. She looked at Nathaniel Blackwood, at his cold, unpitying eyes. He wasn't there to comfort her. He wasn't an ally. He was a predator who had lost his prey, and now he was circling the den, assessing what was left. "So you've come to collect," she said, her voice laced with a bitterness that surprised her. "Is that it? To tell the pregnant wife of the man who conned you that you're taking the bed she's lying in." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed over Nathaniel's face. He leaned back in the chair, steepling his fingers. "On the contrary, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, "I'm here to make you a proposition." The word proposition hung in the sterile air, heavy with unspoken implications. Cordelia stared at him, her mind a maelstrom of grief and fury. A proposition. What could she possibly have that this man, this titan of finance, could possibly want? She was destitute, betrayed and physically broken, tethered to a hospital bed by tubes and wires. "I have nothing to offer you," she said, her voice flat. "Your own words. You are mistaken." Nathaniel countered, his gaze sharp and calculating. "You have two things of immense value. First, you are Richard Sterling's wife. In the eyes of the world and the law, you were his closest confidant. You shared his home, his life. It is presumed you know things, his habits, his contacts, his secrets." "If I knew his secrets, I wouldn't be here," she retorted, gesturing weakly at her surroundings. Perhaps he conceded. Or perhaps you are a more talented actress than he was an actor. It matters little what is true. It matters what is perceived. The second thing you have is his son. Cordelia's blood ran cold. A primal protective instinct flared within her so fierce it momentarily eclipsed her pain. Her hand moved instinctively to her bandaged abdomen. "You will not involve my child in this." "He is already involved," Nathaniel stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "He is Richard Sterling's only heir. That fact alone makes him a significant asset." "He is not an asset," she hissed. "He is my baby." Semantics. Nathaniel dismissed with a slight wave of his hand. "Listen to me carefully, Mrs. Sterling. Richard did not just steal from me. He made me look like a fool. Nathaniel Blackwood does not suffer fools. My reputation, the very foundation upon which my empire is built, is one of meticulous due diligence and unshakable judgment. Richard has tarnished that. I will not allow that to stand. I will find him, and I will dismantle his life as thoroughly as he attempted to dismantle my portfolio." His words were delivered with a chilling intensity, a promise of cold, methodical revenge. He was known in financial circles as the Architect, a name earned for his ability to both construct and demolish corporate structures with breathtaking precision. Cordelia was now seeing the demolition expert firsthand. "This is where you come in," he continued, leaning forward again. "The authorities will move slowly, bound by bureaucracy and jurisdiction. I am not. I have resources they can only dream of. But they have something I do not: public sympathy. A pregnant wife abandoned and betrayed on the day of a critical surgery. You are a media darling in the making. A tragic, compelling figure." Cordelia felt a wave of nausea. He was talking about her life as if it were a strategy, a public relations campaign. "I have no interest in being a media darling," she said. "Your interest is irrelevant," he replied bluntly. "It is what you are. My proposal is this: you will cooperate with me. Exclusively. You will not speak to the FBI, the SEC, or any reporter without my counsel present. In return, I will provide for you. I will cover all your medical expenses, past and future. I will secure the finest legal representation for you, a team led by a man named Alistair Finch." Cordelia's head snapped up. Alistair Finch? He was Rick's lawyer. He was in the waiting room this morning. Yes, a pragmatic man. His loyalty was to the money, not the man. "Now it's my money," Nathaniel said, without a hint of irony. "Mr. Finch will insulate you from the debts Richard has burdened you with, navigating you through the inevitable bankruptcy proceedings. I will also provide you with a secure residence, a place where you and your son can live away from the prying eyes of the press and the questions of federal agents. I will give you a stipend for your living expenses. In short, I will ensure your survival and your son's." It was a lifeline. A devil's bargain, perhaps, but a lifeline nonetheless. He was offering her a shield from the storm that had just broken over her life. "But what was the price, and what do you want from me in return for this generosity?" she asked, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Information," he said simply. "Everything you know about Richard, every friend he ever mentioned, every late-night phone call you overheard, every odd transaction you might have noticed. We will go through your memories with a fine-toothed comb. You may know more than you think, and you will be my public face in this matter. When the time is right, you will give interviews curated by my team. You will tell your story. You will help me control the narrative. You will help me smoke him out." He wanted to use her, to weaponize her pain, her story, her son, to turn her into a pawn in his high-stakes game of revenge and recovery. She looked at his cold, calculating eyes and saw the ruthlessness that had surely made him a billionaire. He was no better than Rick, just on the other side of the crime. But what choice did she have? She was alone, penniless and responsible for a fragile new life. Her family had little money. They couldn't protect her from the fallout of a multi-billion-dollar scandal. The federal government would see her as a potential accomplice. The world would see her as either a fool or a co-conspirator. Nathaniel Blackwood was offering her the one thing she desperately needed: a sanctuary. A gilded cage, perhaps, but a cage that would protect her from the wolves gathering outside. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nathaniel Blackwood stood up his tall frame, seeming to block out the light from the window. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Then Mr. Finch will represent my interests in seizing any and all assets, including those you may try to claim are yours. The hospital will be informed that your benefactor has withdrawn his support, and you will be presented with a bill that will take you several lifetimes to pay. The FBI will be encouraged to look at you not as a victim, but as a person of interest. And you, Mrs. Sterling, will face the world utterly and completely alone." He picked up his briefcase. "You have until your mother returns to decide. I suggest you choose Measley." The choice Cordelia knew was no choice at all. When her mother Helen returned with a cup of lukewarm tea and a face etched with worry, she found her daughter pale but resolute. The news had broken while she was in the cafeteria, and she was bracing herself to comfort a shattered woman. Instead, she found a woman who looked like a soldier surveying a battlefield. "There's a man," Cordelia said, her voice steady. "His name is Nathaniel Blackwood. He's going to help us." Helen looked bewildered, but Cordelia offered no further explanation. When Nathaniel returned, she simply nodded at him. The deal was struck. The days that followed were a surreal blur. While Cordelia recovered from her surgery, her hospital suite became the headquarters for her new life. Alistair Finch, the lawyer who had once served her husband's interests, now sat by her bedside, his demeanor just as stoic, but his allegiance clearly shifted. He explained the legal labyrinth she was in with dispassionate clarity. The co-signed documents were ironclad. She was personally liable for tens of millions of dollars in corporate loans. Bankruptcy was not a possibility. It was a certainty. Under Nathaniel's direction, Finch began the process creating a legal firewall around Cordelia. Every communication was routed through him. The FBI agents who came to question her were met by Alistair, who politely informed them that his client was recovering from major surgery and would provide a statement at a later, more appropriate time. Each day, Cordelia was allowed to visit Arthur in the NICU. He was so small, impossibly so, his tiny body, a tangle of wires and tubes inside his incubator. Looking at his perfect miniature features, she felt a resolve harden within her. This was not just about her survival anymore. It was about his. He would not grow up in the shadow of his father's sins. She would not let him. During the long hours by his side, her mind sifted through the wreckage of her marriage, searching for the red flags she had so willfully ignored. The memories once cherished were now tainted clues in a crime she hadn't known was being committed. There was the time she'd stumbled upon a second set of ledgers in Rick's home office. When she'd asked about them, he'd laughed. "Creative accounting, honey. A little something for the IRS, a little something for us. Everyone does it." He'd been so charming, so dismissive of her concern that she'd accepted the explanation. There were the offshore holding companies he'd set up, which he'd described as tax efficiency strategies. He'd even had her named as a director on one of them, a company registered in Panama. "It's just a title, Cora. It means nothing," he'd assured her as she signed the papers. Alistair Finch now informed her that this shell company had been used to launder millions of dollars. With Nathaniel's team of forensic accountants, a clearer picture of Rick's deception emerged. It was a web of staggering complexity. But as they dug deeper, a new, more sinister thread appeared, one that went beyond financial fraud. One of Nathaniel's investigators, a former MI6 agent named Gavin, uncovered a trust. "It's an old family trust on his mother's side," Gavin explained via a secure video call, his British accent clipped and precise. "The Sterling family was old money, before Richard made his own fortune. The trust is worth approximately $50 million. But there are conditions. A bloodline clause. He couldn't touch the principal. Nathaniel clarified, picking up the thread. He was in the room with Cordelia observing the call, not until he produced a legitimate biological heir. The air in the room grew thin. Cordelia felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "Arthur," she whispered. "Precisely," Gavin confirmed. "The trust stipulates that upon the birth of his firstborn son, the funds become accessible. But there's more. The money was to be transferred to a new account, one controlled solely by the heir's legal guardians. That is Richard and you. The paperwork to establish this new account was filed 3 months ago. It was set to become active upon the official registration of a birth certificate." The full horrifying scope of Rick's plan slammed into Cordelia. His desperation for a child hadn't been about starting a family. Arthur hadn't been a beloved, longed-for son. He was a key, a $50 million key. "He was planning this all along," she said, her voice shaking with a rage so profound it almost choked her. "He needed a baby, a legitimate heir, to unlock that money. The money he would use for his new life after the company collapsed. It would appear, so Nathaniel said, his voice unusually quiet. He was watching her, his grey eyes assessing her reaction. "And me?" she asked the question, tearing from her throat. What was his plan for me? The silence that followed was the answer. She was collateral damage. A vessel. Once the baby was born and the trust was unlocked, she would have been a liability. A loose end. He wouldn't have just left her with debt. The timing of the surgery took on a terrifying new significance. It wasn't just a cover for his escape. It was a moment of extreme vulnerability for both her and the baby. Had the surgery gone wrong? Had she not made it? Rick would have become a grieving widower, a single father with sole custody of the heir and sole access to the $50 million trust. He would have been pitied, not suspected. The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, had not only been prepared to abandon her, he may very well have been hoping for her death. The lie was so monstrous, so complete, that it almost defied belief. Her marriage, her pregnancy, the love she thought they shared, it was all a fabrication, a long con to get his hands on a pot of gold. He had been acting for years. Cordelia looked from Nathaniel's grim face to the photo of Arthur on her phone. The anger coalesced into something hard and sharp inside her chest. It was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. Rick hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen her life, her trust, her past. He had tried to turn her son into a pawn and her into a casualty. "Find him," she said to Nathaniel, her voice low and venomous, devoid of any of its previous fragility. "I don't care what it takes or what it costs. Find him." Nathaniel Blackwood gave a slow, deliberate nod. For the first time, he looked at her not as a pawn or an asset, but as something else entirely, an ally. That he said a ghost of a smile touching his lips was never in doubt. The day Cordelia was discharged from Lenox Hill, the sky over Manhattan was a brilliant, achingly cloudless blue. It felt like a personal insult, a world flaunting a beauty she could no longer feel. The simple act of leaving the hospital was a complex, clandestine operation, orchestrated by Nathaniel Blackwood's invisible hand. There was no triumphant walk out the main entrance. Instead, she was guided through a series of service corridors, the scent of bleach and floor wax replacing the antiseptic air of her room. She sat in the wheelchair, a requirement of hospital policy, but it felt like a symbol of her own fragility. Yet in her arms, she held a universe of strength. Arthur, wrapped tightly in a soft cashmere blanket, was a warm, solid weight against her chest. His tiny rhythmic breaths were the only sound that seemed real. He was the anchor in her swirling chaos. That woman, the one who had checked in as Mrs. Richard Sterling, a name synonymous with tech royalty and philanthropic galas, had died somewhere between the anesthesia and the betrayal. The woman being wheeled out, now dressed in simple clothes, procured by an unknown assistant, was someone else entirely. Someone harder, colder, and forged in the unblinking fire of truth. At a discreet loading bay, a black Escalade waited its engine, humming silently, its tinted windows reflecting the world back at itself, impenetrable and opaque. The driver, a large man with a thick neck and a fading scar that snaked from his ear to his jaw, got out and opened the door without a word. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to handling precious, fragile cargo. This was Nathaniel Blackwood's world, now a world of silent professionals, tactical precision, and deep, unnerving shadows. The Escalade whisked them away from the Upper East Side, leaving the last vestiges of her former life behind. She didn't look back. There was nothing to see but a ghost town of memories. The vehicle moved west toward the Hudson River, eventually pulling into the stark concrete entrance of a private garage beneath a gleaming glass tower in Hudson Yards. Nathaniel was waiting for them, standing beside the elevator bay, his posture as severe and unyielding as the building around them. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. It wasn't a welcome to a home, but an induction into a new reality. He led her to a private elevator that opened directly into a sprawling apartment on the 78th floor. The view was the first thing that hit her, a panoramic vista of the river and the city that was even more commanding than the one from her old penthouse. But this was a cold, corporate beauty. The apartment was a masterpiece of minimalist design, all sharp angles, cool tones, and polished surfaces. It smelled of new paint and expensive leather, an anonymous, uninhabited scent. It was not a home. It was a holding cell, a gilded core designed for absolute security. The building has the best residential security system in the city. Nathaniel explained, his voice a low monotone, as he gave her the tour. The elevators are biometric, keyed only to my prints, and as of 5 minutes ago, yours. All windows are ballistic glass. There is a staff on my payroll, a driver, a nanny, and a cook who will be at your disposal. They have all been thoroughly vetted and have signed non-disclosure agreements thicker than a novel. Vetted Cordelia knew meant they were his eyes and ears. Her keepers. My prison, she stated, her voice flat. She walked across the vast living room to the floor-to-ceiling window, bouncing a slightly fussy Arthur on her shoulder. The city below looked like a circuit board, a network of impersonal connections, a sanctuary. Nathaniel corrected his tone, unwavering. He came to stand beside her, his reflection a dark spectre in the glass. Richard Sterling made powerful enemies Mrs. Sterling. I am merely the one with the most vested interest in his capture. The others, he swindled construction magnates, Russian oligarchs, pension fund managers, might not to be as methodical in their pursuit of justice. You and your son are loose ends. You need to be protected. She knew he was right, but the protection felt suffocating. The first few weeks were an exercise in controlled monotony. The nanny, a stern but impeccably capable woman from Austria, named Maria, handled Arthur with a professionalism that bordered on clinical. The cook prepared nutritionally balanced meals that Cordelia ate without tasting. Her days found a new grim rhythm. Mornings were for Arthur. Afternoons were for the war room. Nathaniel had converted one of the spare bedrooms into a command center. Here she met daily with Alistair Finch and a rotating team of Nathaniel's investigators led by the unflappable ex-MI6 agent Gavin. Surrounded by whiteboards, financial charts, and satellite maps, Cordelia methodically dissected her life with Rick. It was excruciating, like performing an autopsy on her own heart. Think Cordelia Gavin would press his British accent always polite, even when he was relentless. Did he ever mention offshore banking? Any specific countries? Even as a joke. One afternoon, staring at a list of shell corporations, one name, Argos Maritime, triggered a memory. He was on the phone late one night, she said, slowly closing her eyes to picture it. He was angry. He said something about, "The Argos deal is leaking like a sieve. We need a Cypriot firewall." She'd assumed it was business jargon. Now she repeated the words, and Gavin's pen flew across his notepad. Each memory was a weapon. Each forgotten detail, a bullet. She worked with a ferocity that surprised even herself, fueled by a cold, simmering rage. This was not grief. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. This was a reckoning. One evening, Nathaniel found her in the command center, long after the others had left. She was staring at a large map of the Mediterranean, a single red pin stuck in the island of Cyprus. Arthur was asleep in his bassinet, beside the desk, a small island of peace in a sea of conspiracy. "You've adapted," he observed, pouring himself a glass of water from a pitcher on the credenza. "Adaptation is a necessity for survival," she replied, her gaze fixed on the map. "I learned that from my husband. He adapted from a loving husband to a monster quite seamlessly." He was silent for a moment, studying her profile. "Alistair informed me that the final bankruptcy papers were filed today. You are cleared of all personal debt. In the eyes of the law, you are free." "I won't be free until he's found," she said, finally turning to meet his gaze. Her eyes, he noted, were different now. The soft, trusting warmth was gone, replaced by a sharp, intelligent fire that seemed to see right through him. "What's our next move?" She had started saying and it was no longer an accident. "My people have confirmed the lead," he said, his voice lowering. "A significant cash withdrawal was made from an account in Nicosia linked to Zara Vance. It was sloppy, desperate. They're getting comfortable, or they're running out of clean money. We're moving on it." Cordelia felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, but it was tempered now with cold strategy. They'll run again. He'll have contingencies for his contingencies. "We will be waiting," Nathaniel assured her. He was about to say more, but he stopped, his gaze falling on the sleeping baby. Arthur stirred his little hand, clenching and unclenching around the edge of his blanket. For all the talk of assets and heirs, he was just a child, perfect and innocent. Cordelia followed his gaze, and her expression transformed. All the hardness, all the anger melted away as she looked at her son. He was the one pure, true thing to come out of the wreckage. Rick had seen him as a key. Nathaniel saw him as leverage. But she saw him as her entire world. He was her reason, her motivation. Rick and Nathaniel were playing a game of billions of revenge and reputation. But her fight was for something far more valuable. She reached down and gently stroked Arthur's cheek with the back of her finger. Her resolve hardened once more. But this time it was different. It wasn't just about anger. It was about fierce, unyielding love. She turned back to Nathaniel, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. "When you find him," she said, "I want to be there. I don't mean in the country. I mean in the room. I want him to look me in the eye when his world comes crashing down." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "That would be irregular and dangerous." "It's non-negotiable," she countered, her voice like steel. "You want to dismantle his finances. I want to dismantle him. He needs to see that his greatest victim, the woman he left for dead, was instrumental in his downfall. He needs to see Arthur, the son he tried to use as a bank key, thriving in my arms. That is a punishment no court can deliver. That is the justice I will have. Without it, your victory is incomplete." Nathaniel Blackwood looked at the woman before him, the mother protecting her child. The survivor forged in betrayal, and he saw not a pawn, but a queen dictating the terms of surrender. He saw a partner whose motivations were now as pure and as dangerous as his own. He gave a slow, respectful nod. The battle was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. Cordelia's journey has just begun. The woman who entered that operating theater is gone, replaced by a survivor forged in the fires of betrayal. With the enigmatic Nathaniel Blackwood as both her keeper and her key, she stands at a precipice. Will she reclaim the life that was stolen from her, or will she build a new one from the ashes, more powerful than before? The battle against Richard Sterling isn't just about money. It's about justice, survival, and the fierce, unyielding love for her child. What do you think she should do next? Let us know in the comments below. If you were captivated by Cordelia's story of survival and deception, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a good drama, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible saga.